Welcome back to Pod Save the World. I'm Tommy Vietor.
I'm Ben Rhodes.
It's a very August day here in the
hot.
Crooked Media office.
It's like straight up hot.
Hot and empty.
There's nobody here.
Yeah, it's only the Pod Save the World crew.
You've been something of a content machine, Tommy.
I'm sick of
every
hearing myself.
podcast I turn on and I hear you.
I got no takes left.
You're driving everyone.
They're gone.
Yeah. Just empty out that bank of tapes.
And then take a couple days off. But we got a great show for you today. We're going to talk about why international soccer is a cesspool of sexism and just horrible people, what it means that the BRICS organization is expanding, everything you wanted to know about the Panama Canal and more, thanks to Donald Trump and Tucker Carlson, Saudi Arabia's treatment of migrants and what the U.S. knew, France and religion, former French President Nicolas Sarkozy has a book out, Ben. He's making some waves. Elections in Zimbabwe, a racist minister in Israel, probably more than one, and India lands a rover on the moon. And then, Ben, you did our interview today. What do we learn about?
Yeah, we're staying on the Prigozhin story because it's so endlessly fascinating. So we have Joshua Yaffa on today, New Yorker writer, longtime correspondent in Moscow, who recently wrote an amazing piece that we talked about last week about Prigozhin and Wagner and its history and ideology and characters. So we talk about, Prigozhin's legacy, what's likely to happen next with Wagner. He had some pretty interesting insights on that. Why Putin made the choice to blow a plane out of the sky when there were like less messy ways of taking care of business, and kind of what does this mean for the future of Russian politics. It's great.
It was interesting the way to see it unfolded. Like Putin finally talked about Prigozhin in the past tense, and then a couple of days later they finally admitted that he was deceased. And I think Prigozhin now has a grave, I believe.
Yes, he's buried today.
It's got 100-yard walls around it. You can't get close to it.
I said to Joshua, it's like going to be a pilgrimage for, former mercenaries and a weird collection of fascists. And,
weird. Yeah. I also saw, this is all on Twitter, but like videos allegedly of somebody digging up Wagner graves, which is pretty intense.
Pretty dark.
Just erasing them from history.
That's... Russia's in a pretty strange place right now.
Not ideal. But anyway, let's talk about Spain, Ben, because it's been about over a week since the Spanish women's team won the Women's World Cup. And unfortunately, the thing that's captured the world's attention is a scandal involving the president of the Royal Spanish Federation, who was harassing a top player named Jennifer Hermoso. Luis Rubiales is Spain's top soccer official and a complete creep. There's a video of him after the game kissing Hermoso when the women's team clinched the title. There's also a video of him grabbing his crotch in close proximity to the Spanish queen and her teenage daughter, which is very classy.
By the way, it's a crazy crotch grab, too. Like, is that a thing that people do? Like,
are you a pro wrestler?
Yeah, it was very weird.
Yeah, why would you grab your crotch like that? I've never seen an adult do that.
I really haven't. I didn't know that was a thing that grown-ups did.
Was it Baker Mayfield or Johnny Manziel? Somebody did it on a sideline at like a Texas-Oklahoma game.
Yeah. But probably both those guys, actually.
Yeah, probably multiple times, if we're being honest. Anyway, enough about what I've been watching on Netflix.
Sorry,
The incident, though, sparked an outcry and what many are calling a Me Too moment for Spain. Hermoso described Rubiales' actions as impulse-driven, sexist, and out of place, and said she felt like a victim of an aggression. This was very, very clearly not a consensual kiss. Since then, the entire team has said they wouldn't play for Spain if the current managers continue. FIFA has provisionally suspended Rubiales for 90 days. The Spanish government has sent a complaint to Spain's sports tribunal, and Spanish prosecutors have opened an investigation into whether or not he could be charged with committing an act of sexual aggression. Rubiales refuses to quit. He says he's the victim of, quote, false feminism and social assassination. There's a couple people out there defending him. They include the Royal Spanish Football Federation, which at one point threatened to sue Hermoso for defamation. And then Rubiales' mom, who says she's going on a hunger strike.
In a church or something.
In church.
Yeah.
I would say, ma'am, less hunger striking, more parenting.
Yes.
A couple decades ago. But anyway, Spain's prime minister and even very conservative political leaders in Spain have criticized Rubiales for what he did. But Ben, if you think sexism in soccer is only a problem in Spain, allow me to read for you a quote from Gianni Infantino, the president of FIFA. This is from earlier this month. In this quote, this is from the FT. He's offering advice to women soccer players who just want equal treatment. That's all they're asking for, equal treatment by FIFA. He says, quote, I say to all the women, and you know I have 4 daughters, so I have a few at home, that you have the power to change. Pick the right battles. You have the power to convince us men what we have to do and what we don't have to do. You do it, just do it. With me, with FIFA, you will find open doors. Just push the doors. They are open. This is the same asshole, by the way, around the Qatar World Cup who was like, today I am Qatari. Today I am gay. Today I'm just the biggest idiot ever. Yeah. It's really, though, like hard to imagine a more tone deaf, like toxic group of idiots in power. Totally. I'm not even sure where you look.
I mean, I get a sports take and a worldo take on this. I mean, on the sports angle, it's kind of interesting. And you know, the U.S. is far from perfect, right? Our women, even as they were like crushing international competitions,
while the men didn't make the
while the men like, you know, flamed out, that they were getting paid less than the men, you know. So like, I'm not suggesting we're perfect, but like we do have because of Title IX and investments made in equity, you know, 50 years ago, there is at least a more evolved women's sports ecosystem. It's still imperfect. And I think part of what you see as you look at women's soccer and women's sports globally is like different countries are like, some are like have really solid programs and they have equity, and then you run into something like this, like, where this is just like a cesspool of the worst kind of machismo in a country, by the way, Spain, that has kind of two strands. Like on the one hand, they have this kind of deep Catholic, you know, Franco traditional patriarchy, but then they also have incredibly liberal gender equity laws. A lot of their cities have been like hubs for gender policy that empowers women and girls. So this is definitely tilting the balance in that direction. The world take I'd make is that, you know, one of the things that was chilling about this is that out of the gate, like Hermoso like issued a statement retracting her initial statement that literally sounded like it had been dictated by some male goon in the front office, you know, and
felt forced.
Yeah, there's a lot of like, and you know, autocratic kind of intimidation that you could feel like right behind the curtain, and how these women were kind of being compelled to do things. Two coaches resigned because they were like forced to sit the front row of this bizarre press conference where he said he wasn't resigning. And the women, thankfully, banded together and issued a joint statement, have really gone on offense, and players deserve the credit for kind of pushing this debate. But the point I'd make is that it's interesting. We cover a lot of autocratic governments, how similar like the vibe is of these guys. Like they seem very corrupt.
Mafia organization.
They seem very mafioso. They intimidate and try to get people to self-censor. They act like they have impunity. So it is telling how. And we've seen this in sports, by the way. The IOC, the International Olympic Committee, started to take on the kind of the character of a corrupt autocratic government, you know. And you've seen this in the World Cup politics that you've covered. Mm-hmm. Like, we need to small d democratize these institutions because they do matter a lot.
Yeah, and small f fire this guy.
Yeah.
But I mean, imagine if Rubiales had kissed Lionel Messi.
Yeah.
It would have been no less unwanted.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? Or Roger Goodell comes down after the Super Bowl and kisses Tom Brady. It's like, nobody wants that.
No.
You're not dating. Leave her the fuck alone.
And on camera, in front of the world, it was just disgusting. And whatever sense of supremacy that guy has in his head to think he could do that and there'd be no consequence is pretty astounding.
Yeah, I hope he gets fired. His mom departs the church, goes and gets some breakfast and rethinks a few things. Okay, so last week, Ben, we talked about how the BRICS summit, mostly in the context of how Vladimir Putin had to zoom into the meeting because he was worried about a little international arrest warrant. Oops. Today, let's talk about the BRICS organization itself and the summit itself. BRICS stands for Brazil, Russia, India, China, and South Africa, at least for now. The current members represent 40% of the world's population and a quarter of global GDP. So on paper, like, you know, they got a lot going on. At the summit, they announced that Iran, Saudi Arabia, the UAE, Argentina, Egypt, and Ethiopia are set to join in 2024. It's not totally clear to me if that's a done deal. Like the Saudi foreign minister's comment about this was kind of like, yeah, like we got your invite. Like
maybe let's see if we get our American nuclear program.
Yeah, like we'd love to know who else is there before we, RSVP. Yes, but it would be the first expansion of the organization since 2010 when South Africa joined. And the BRICS, led by China, are pretty clear now and open about the goals of blunting U.S. influence internationally. That means peeling apart U.S. alliances. It means pushing countries to move away from the U.S. dollar as a reserve currency. So Ben, obviously, these are some of the biggest countries in the world, 40% of the world's population. If you add a bunch more countries to the organization, it will have even more influence. But it's never been totally clear to me when people sort of worry about the BRICS influence, how good they are at coordinating or how effective they are. Like, what's your take on how much these guys actually throw their weight around?
Yeah, I mean, it's strange because it's entirely this kind of artificial construct. I mean, the funny thing about an organization designed to blunt the West is that the BRIC acronym has its origins in like a Goldman Sachs analyst
from like 10 years ago, right?
Being like,
researcher.
So it's kind of a weird creation of Western money that wanted to invest in these places. All that said, I think it's like it's not like what people need to understand is there's not like a formal coordinating set of mechanisms. This is not NATO where there's like military interoperability and a mutual defense treaty. It's not even quite on the par of like, say, the G20 coordinated action around the global economy. It's very ad hoc, right? Mm-hmm. So it's a bunch of countries that have in common that they're not in the G7, basically. They're not in the Western Club meeting and having different agendas. Now, where they've been able to work together is on some development-related issues and some development financing, and it's a forum where if you meet and you develop relationships and habits, like you can do some joint project work. But it's not that evolved in terms of what is it doing, and so I think before we think it's like a totally parallel world order, you have to remember that it's basically meetings with some joint projects that they do together.
Yeah, like once a year.
Yeah, and then if you look internal to the BRICS, I think there are different interests for the countries at the table. The Russians and Chinese clearly want to use it to like take on the United States. I don't think that's why the Brazilians and Indians and South Africans show up. Yeah, they don't like certain things about the U.S. They don't like sanctions, for instance, and they don't like the U.S. domination of certain institutions, so they just like to have another venue. But I don't think that those countries are like invested in destroying the world order in the same way that the Russians and Chinese are. So there's like some, daylight between those countries. And then lastly, these countries coming in, kind of a weird eclectic group that only has in common they're kind of on the right side of the Chinese because they're trending autocratic, like the Egyptians, their economy is in the total shitter, but they've got this like autocrat in Sisi. The Gulf countries, everybody's kind of courting for their cash. The Ethiopians are in the middle of a civil war.
Argentina's got some economic problems.
Argentina's got a little economic problems, and they've got a like crazy libertarian about to get elected president. Yep. So, I mean, I think what we could take away from this is that there's a growing number of countries that just want to have alternatives, and that the Chinese and Russians are really intent on trying to build alternatives to the U.S. But I don't think that just, the symbolic announcement of an enlargement of the BRICS like augurs some new set of institutions. It just means more countries are going to show up at this meeting regularly and try to coordinate on some stuff.
Yeah, this was a 2001 research paper by a Goldman Sachs analyst named Jim O'Neill. Yeah. We in the West are so good at psyching ourselves out when these meetings happen.
Little did Jim O'Neill know.
Can you imagine
what he was giving birth to?
You're just like Goldman guy, you crank out like 400 research things a year.
Just take a bump of Coke and write a memo, like before hitting the bar at like 1 in the morning.
And everyone's like, that's a great idea. Usually that's not how it works. You write a horrible screenplay and you're like, anyway. So the summit itself, Xi Jinping was the center of the whole thing. He was the only one greeted at the airport by the South African president. Even Indian Prime Minister Narendra Modi got the deputy. So that's a big deal. Xi was also given a state visit. He was inducted into the Order of South Africa, some like sort of honor system. Xi and Modi had a bilateral meeting on the margins of the summit. They agreed to de-escalate tensions on their shared border. That is a very good thing, because I remember a couple of years ago talking to you about the time when Indian and Chinese soldiers were literally fighting hand-to-hand combat with like spiked clubs.
Clubbing each other to death.
At 14,000 feet in the Himalayan mountains, killing each other.
Yeah.
Like knocking dudes off mountains.
Yeah.
Someday that story will be written. Anyway, the weird part about this event, Xi skipped the big speech he was going to give. I think he had this like commerce minister do it and then offered no explanation why he skipped it. Russia is supposed to assume the BRICS chairmanship next year and host the next summit in Russia. So that will be great.
Yeah, that'd be a nice venue to turn up at these days. But the Russia piece speaks to the tension of this because, most of these countries, I believe, and in my experience, they're showing up for reasons of economic and development interest or frustration with things that the U.S. does that runs counter to that. Like, China offers something in that space. Like Russia, it looked a lot better when Jim O'Neill was writing memos than today. Like there's not a lot of like there's oil, I guess. Like so people keep buying Russian oil, but like it's not like Russia's like where I'd be buying long-term stock in. No. So these countries that want to join are now going to have to turn up in the middle of a war probably and hang out with Putin at a big table. Like, it's kind of it's not I would be hoping for the meeting in Rio instead of Moscow. Let's just put it that way.
Yeah, not my idea of a good time. Okay, let's turn to the Panama Canal for a minute, Ben.
Yeah.
We don't get to talk about it.
Great content here.
So I'm sure everyone remembers the hilarious week on Twitter when the Suez Canal, very different canal, was blocked by a big ship that ran aground. There were lots of great memes, 6 days of laughs, but I think it probably cost the global economy tens of billions of dollars. I don't know how much more. But there's an even bigger problem brewing in the Panama Canal, where 40% of all U.S. container traffic passes through each day. So drought exacerbated by climate change is slowing down ship traffic in the Panama Canal. It's leading to backups. It's leading to reduced cargo volumes for the ships that actually make it through because there's not enough water for them to fully load up. So they have to unload some things to lighten up the ships. This is not a problem that's unique to Panama. All over the world, rivers are drying up and slowing, if not stopping, shipping routes. Remember last year when big rivers in Germany were like so dry that there were Viking ships sticking up out of the ground. But 90% of global goods travel via ocean shipping. So this is a large and growing problem. But Ben, when it comes to the Panama Canal, one guy has got it figured out.
Yeah, where do you turn for analysis? Tell me on this.
You turn to Donald Trump in his interview with Tucker Carlson. Here's a clip.
So we built a thing called the Panama Canal. We lost 35,000 people to the mosquito, malaria.
Yeah.
We lost 35,000 people building. We lost 35,000 people because of the mosquito. Vicious. They had to build under nets. It was one of the true great wonders of the world. As he said, one of the 9 wonders of the world. No, it was one of the 7. It happened a little while ago, It says 9 wonders of the world. You could make 9 wonders. He would have been better off if he stuck with the 9 and just said, yeah, I think it's 9. But this is one of the true 7 wonders of the world. And you take a look at the Panama Canal. It was such an incredible engineering marvel. We sold it under Jimmy Carter. We sold it to Panama for $1. The following day, they quadrupled the amount of money that ships had to pay to get across. They didn't lose one ship. And now they've made it much bigger, and now they've widened it. They've doubled it, right? They've more than doubled it.
We actually cut that down because it went
It goes on for like a good 5 minutes. And he comes back to it, too. I think he circles back to it.
He's mad about it at the end. Listeners are probably too young to remember that the Panama Canal, the Panama Canal Treaty is incredibly controversial in the 70s and 80s. Ronald Reagan beat the shit out of Jimmy Carter over handing over the Panama Canal. But wow, was that incoherent? He sounded drugged?
Yeah. I think he took some mushrooms before hanging out with Tucker, I guess. I don't know. The long wind-in at the 9 and 7 wonders and the vicious mosquitoes and the 35,000 dead. That's the part that reminds you that this guy, literally, if he said that in a job interview for any job in this entire country other than President of the United States, he couldn't get the job.
Yeah.
So that's alarming.
Get me out of here.
To be clear, 35,000. We used a lot of Panamanian labor. Those guys died. I don't know which 35,000 people he was referring to, but a lot of them were, people from that part of the world, not coming down from the U.S. I think the one thing that's interesting to me though is there is this kind of weird Trumpian foreign policy where that is the kind of thing you would care about. It's like everything with Trump. There's a germ of something that is relatively interesting, which is he kind of supports this very self-interested kind of capitalist version of our interests. It's not like the neocon, It's not like we need to project military force and have a de facto empire to transform the world in our image. It's like, hey, if we had a deal on this canal, we shouldn't have given up the deal, even if it was going to be completely untenable for the United States to basically run a colony into the 21st century in the middle of Central America. That, just to be clear, Jimmy Carter was right. But this is Trump's view of the world. It's a bunch of transactions, and all he cares about is some monetary interest separate from anything else.
Yeah. And to be fair, I think that Jimmy Carter actually kind of demagogued the issue before handing over ownership of the canal. I think he beat up on Gerald Ford about it. But anyway, it's a weird combination of, you're right, it's just purely like, what money can we extract from other countries? And also probably somewhere in his addled brain, he remembers this being a thing people talked about on the news back when he was at Studio 54 or whatever. But then we also noticed that Tucker Carlson is back in Budapest doing paid speeches, doing live events. Any favorite moments from Tucker's trip, fascist year abroad?
Well, like the thing about Tucker is, he was there hanging out with his buddy Orban, but he also like gives speeches, and he met with like Orban's kind of chief political strategist, who's this kind of like, 30-something fascistic light guy. And the thing that stood out to me about Tucker is how deep like he is insistent on like there being like a profound ideology behind this movement towards autocracy. Like at the end of the day, Orban's really just about like a bunch of corrupt guys consolidating power and like wrapping some Hungarian identity politics around it. And Tucker goes over there and like articulates this like messianic vision of like Christian, democracy, Christian strongman democracy that's going to cross the Atlantic to Washington that's been utterly corrupted. But he's just hanging out with a bunch of corrupt oligarchs, I mean, I think, look, to be fair, Orban is an ideologue, but like Tucker's like intense interest in hugging these guys is pretty telling, and everything he says is the opposite, like the true democracy is hungry. And I mean, if you want an explanation about how Donald Trump can be like literally arrested for trying to overthrow the government and yet be seen as the true Democrat, like Tucker kind of offers the ideological case for that on journeys like this.
Yeah, and you're hearing this a lot from him. He acts like Christians are under attack in a lot of places when they're not. Like, he's really seized on the idea that President Zelensky is attacking Christians within Ukraine, when in reality what he was doing, I think, was targeting elements of the Russian Orthodox Church that were seen as political allies of Putin. No, you can take issue with that if you want, but the idea that there's some like wave of anti-Christian attacks coursing through Ukraine is a little ridiculous, and it does make you wonder if he's only saying that because Zelensky is Jewish.
Yeah, and because Putin uses this line that like the Orthodox Church and et cetera is at the center of what he's doing. I mean, the one thing I'd say that Tucker also did is he kept saying that Biden was trying to undermine Hungarian democracy, which is not true, by the way. I actually think Biden should be doing more to try to support actual democracy in Hungary. But at the same time, what he's calling for is the same thing he's criticizing. He's calling for like the U.S. to pick winners like Orban and back them up. So it's pretty grotesque, and it's very fascist adjacent.
And I didn't see this for myself, but I think Tucker attacked by name our former colleague David Pressman, who is now the U.S. ambassador to Hungary. So nice of him.
Yeah, he's attacking America's government, America's ambassador, America's interests in service of like Orban. Yeah,
very, very, very cool. Great guy. Okay, let's take a quick break. When we come back, we are going to talk about Saudi Arabia. Pod Save the World is brought to you by Factor. With the busy fall season just around the corner, you might be looking for wholesome, convenient meals for jam-packed days. Factor is America's #1 ready-to-eat meal kit. It can help you fuel up fast with chef-prepared, dietitian-approved, ready-to-eat meals delivered straight to your door. Too busy with your end-of-summer goals to cook, but want to make sure you're eating well? With Factor, skip the extra trip to the grocery store and the chopping, prepping, and cleaning up too, while still getting the flavor and nutritional quality you need. Level up with Gourmet Plus options prepared to perfection by chefs and ready to eat in record time. Treat yourself to upscale meals with premium ingredients like broccolini, leeks, truffle butter, and asparagus. This August, get Factor and enjoy eating well without the hassle. Simply choose your meals and enjoy fresh, flavor-packed meals delivered to your door, ready in 2 minutes with no prep and no mess. I recently had the roasted garlic chicken meal. It was delicious. There's also a red pepper queso chicken, also fantastic. You really just can't beat ready in 2 minutes or less. There's nothing out there that's that fast. Not delivery, not anything in your fridge. Try Factor. You will love it. Head to factormeals.com/crookedworld50 and use code crookedworld50 to get 50% off. That's code crookedworld50 at factormeals.com/crookedworld50 to get 50% off. Factormeals.com/crookedworld50. Use the code crookedworld50. This episode of Pod Save the World is brought to you by Cariuma, the cool, sustainable sneaker company with old school style and new school ethics. As summer starts to come to a close, we need a pair of shoes that are versatile, seasonless, and that go with everything. With over 40,000 five-star reviews, Cariuma has got you covered with shoes that have a classic look, are crazy comfy, and are consciously crafted to transition you from hot summer days to crisp autumn evenings. Worn by celebrities and praised by publications like Vogue and GQ, these kicks are a cult fave, and we absolutely love them. And now the Akka we all know and love is made for kids. Akka Low Kids have Velcro straps and extra cushion for easy and comfortable wear. Match your littles and make it a bundle by adding on a pair for you. They're 100% vegan and carefully crafted with organic cotton canvas, made for our little tree planters, earth lovers, and mini explorers. These shoes look really cute. I love my Cariumas. I'm wearing a pair as we speak. My daughter doesn't wear a lot of shoes because she's 8 months old, but someday she'll have some Cariumas. And for a limited time, Pod Save the World listeners can get an exclusive 15% off your Cariuma sneakers. Go to cariuma.com/world to get 15% off. cariuma.com/world for 15% off, only for a limited time. So Ben, last week we talked about this horrifying report by Human Rights Watch that documented a policy in Saudi Arabia of indiscriminate murder of Ethiopian migrants by these Saudi border agents. It alleged that these security officials were firing rockets and mortars at groups of Ethiopian women and children. Often those who survived those attacks were often detained and tortured. So after this Human Rights Watch research was released, the New York Times reported that the U.S. government was informed about these abuses as far back as last fall and got a full presentation on what was happening by UN officials in December. The State Department told the Times, the United States quickly engaged senior Saudi officials and to express our concern, and that U.S. officials have continued to regularly raise our concerns with Saudi contacts. So I think I read that and I was instinctively kind of blinded with rage because I do want the U.S. policy on Saudi Arabia to be more Joe Biden in the campaign than Joe Biden in the White House, right? Where he was calling out MBS for being a pariah and being a bloodthirsty killer, et cetera. I did want to sort of take seriously what I think their response is, which is basically in diplomacy, you have different tools you can use in different situations. You can name and shame, right? You can sanction countries, but sometimes quiet conversations are the best way to get the thing you want done. I'm not ascribing to this in this situation, but it was something we experienced in the Arab Spring, right? When we weren't necessarily calling on every leader to go when they were repressing their populations. There were some places where you could pull someone aside and say, hey, we'll punish you in these ways and do it privately and maybe have some more luck. I don't know. I'm just wondering what you would make of that response and, the White House saying, look at every time we've criticized MBS. He not only doesn't do what we want, he does the opposite of what we want. He sticks his thumb in our eye, et cetera, et cetera.
I mean, look, my view of this is MBS has very negative reactions when you criticize him publicly, which I think shows that he cares.
Yeah, good point.
And
turns out it's working.
And look, it may risk, him, signing the BRICS application faster or something. But at the end of the day, what he's trying to do is create a dynamic in which, because, if he has the leverage of, if you criticize me, you're not going to like how I respond. Well, the implicit in that is that you're never allowed to criticize me.
Exactly.
So this is one of the things where the logic of the private diplomacy doesn't seem to yield an outcome. It's actually not about trying to achieve a better outcome in terms of, Saudi human rights. It seems more about just trying to achieve a better outcome in terms of not having MBS, to be generous to the Biden team, to not have him pick up his toys and walk away because he's just tired of us saying these things.
And by pick up his toys and walk away, in this case, there's the other thing that's been floated about the Saudis recently is there's all this talk about the U.S. cutting a deal between the Saudis and Israel, or a normalization deal that might include the U.S. providing them with nuclear energy technology. I noticed, I think it was the Wall Street Journal the other day, floated a story from Saudi officials about how they're also considering Chinese nuclear technology.
Yeah. And look, at the end of the day, they can buy nuclear technology. They have unlimited wealth. I mean, I guess what I'd say is I don't want to be in a partnership where you're only allowed to do what one of your partners says you can do. like the U.S. is kind of making itself the junior partner in this, when in fact the Saudi military is built entirely to kind of plug into American support when in fact like our economy, they're going to need us. It's like they can totally abandon the United States economically. Like we have leverage here, and clearly we also have reputational leverage that MBS cares a lot about, and so I would use it. And I think that you're basically saying like, well, if we're not going to say anything that MBS isn't like, what's the point of it all?
Yeah, what's the point of having a communications office? Yeah, at a time when he's trying to launder the Saudi reputation by buying every soccer player on the planet, it might be good to say publicly, hey, you should stop firing mortars into groups of innocent people. And if that upsets you, then, I don't know, change the policy.
Yeah.
It's infuriating. Okay, let's talk about France, if you don't mind. The French, as you know, can be intense about a few things. The wine, the cheese, they like to burn cities to the ground if you raise the retirement age. And what they call laïcité, I think is how you say it. I don't even know. Anyone have a French speaker in here? Secularism.
Yeah.
They're aggressively secular. They want religion out of the public sphere. And that brings us to a controversial new rule that was announced by the French education minister this weekend, who announced that France is going to ban the abaya in schools. That is a long, sort of flowing garment worn often by Muslim women. Many religious symbols are already banned in French schools and have been since 2004. That includes, big crosses, yarmulkes, headscarves. The abaya didn't fall under the previous ban because it was less religious than cultural in terms of significance. But the French, he made this move over the weekend. French teachers unions say this is just an attempt by President Macron to win points with French right-wing voters. Ben, I was curious what you made of this one. Like, on the one hand, separation of church and state sounds pretty good to me. Like, I support, pretty severe separations. And I also understand, like, the history in France, right? Yeah. This goes back to the French Revolution. But this instance did seem like a bridge too far in that you're punishing like a small group of Muslim women for wearing a garment that is not overtly religious. And everyone seems to agree with that. So I'm just kind of not sure what this does besides further alienate Muslim communities that have not been integrated into the country at all.
Yeah, I mean, I think, I do take seriously this French commitment to secularism. It is like a part of their national identity, even if I don't agree with it, and kind of my more Americanized view of things stresses like the individual making that decision more than the state saying, certain things. Like it's a real interest that they have, and it's not invented entirely. That said, this one felt like, number one, this isn't a particularly, exclusively religious garment. Like this is something that's more like people wear this across the Middle East and North Africa, and it's not. It's possible you could be just choosing to wear something that, I mean, some of the best takedowns of this on social media are like, there are things that are like abaya adjacent, like, or are they banned? Like, what's the, exact implementation of this? But the other thing is, it felt like, I don't know, sometimes when these announcements come out, it doesn't feel like there was some inclusive process of consideration. It feels like this kind of dictate from the French government,
It's sort of out of nowhere.
And I mean, it was, I guess, ostensibly because the school year is coming up. It didn't feel like they'd done a lot of work with civil society and different groups. No. And that kind of plays into is this really about secularism, or is this about, trying to like tilt the cultural, dynamic politically to the right a bit? And that's what this feels like to me.
Yeah, and there were some Islamic advocacy groups said these are the clothes police dictating what women could wear, like they do in Afghanistan, Iran, and now France. I thought that was a fair point and tough category to be put in.
Yeah. Nobody wants to be in that particular company. I will say, again, like we have to understand that there is a very powerful strain in Europe right now that is like reactionary. And so that's why it's important to cover and watch these things, because it's noteworthy to see where it manifests. And what I take from this, too, is that this is the schools, right? And so in the same way that culture wars here have entered our schools, this is a French version of that taking place. I'm sure it probably polls pretty well in France, too, frankly. But, as the more and more as these cultural issues and identity issues get into schools, like the more intense the emotions get around them, I think.
Yes, absolutely. Speaking of France, former French President Nicolas Sarkozy has a memoir coming out. He's doing lots of interviews around it, as one does, to sell his book on his book tour. He is, of course, getting asked about the Russian invasion of Ukraine. He also wrote about it in the book. Some of his interview answers are raising eyebrows. Here's a couple quotes from a roundup in the New York Times. Sarkozy said that reversing Russia's annexation of Crimea was illusory. He ruled out Ukraine joining the European Union or NATO because it must remain neutral, and insisted that Russia and France need each other. He also told Le Figaro, people tell me Vladimir Putin isn't the same man that I met. I don't find that convincing. I've had tens of conversations with him. He is not irrational. And he talks about how European interests are not aligned with American interests this time. There's probably some points there, right? Like, obviously, they have a much greater natural gas dependency than the United States does. But The Guardian also got a copy of the book where he refers to both sides of the conflict sparked by the Russian invasion as belligerents, which is surprising since one side invaded the other. He criticizes U.S. and EU support of Ukraine. He wants Russia to renounce all military action against its neighbors, Ukraine to pledge to remain neutral, and NATO basically respect Russia's fear of being encircled by unfriendly neighbors. So some of Sarkozy's former aides have criticized these comments and pointed out that Sarkozy seems to think that he prevented World War III back in 2008 when the French and the Germans blocked Georgia and Ukraine from entering NATO. But he also doesn't take any responsibility for the fact that Georgia was invaded about 4 months after that happened. But what did you make of this? Like, why do you think he's sounding off on these things now?
Well, I think the reason this is an interesting story, too, is that I think he was paid something like $3 million by some Russian insurance company, too. So
I wonder what for.
There's a bunch of different things happening here. Like, part of it is that I think there's like just some basic corruption of the European political establishment by the Russians. Like, for, the most obvious example is Gerhard Schröder in Germany, the former chancellor of Germany, who was on literally the board of Gazprom and basically advocating Russian interests. But you see, in Italy, you see some politicians that have a lot of financial links into Russia. Obviously, in like Central and Eastern Europe, there's like full scale kind of corrupt business relationships between Russians and Russian oligarchs, and so. The first point is, the Russians have invested for a long time in kind of, financial leverage or relationships with political leaders, and some that is paying dividends. I think also embedded in Sarkozy's comments, this is the guy who used to be seen as like the pro-American French leader. Like, there's pretty deep-seated sympathy for the Russian argument that the Americans kind of pushed us into this war and NATO expansion caused it, and kind of Ukraine has some flaws too, and I think that again is going to be an important trend if people want to continue to support Ukraine. That's going to get more powerful, I think. So those two things kind of come together in Sarkozy: corruption and kind of this vein of Russian thinking that is infected parts of Europe. When we were trying to get sanctions on Russia in 2015 and 16 after the annexation of Crimea and the first move into the Donbass, the French were one of the hardest countries to get fully on board because they were always trying to carve out, exceptions for the sectors where they were doing a bunch of business and stuff. And Hollande, who was the president of France at that time, positions himself as this hawk. I mean, we had to pull that guy into sanctions. So it's just a reminder of like, this is an uphill climb, and the support we felt for Ukraine in the first 6 months of the invasion, that support was probably the high watermark, and it's just trying to keep it from slipping,
Yeah, there's some analysts think that, the more the counteroffensive is seen as struggling, the more free people will feel to just be sort of overly critical, which is, of course, they're right. I mean, there's a lot of things to be concerned about in this war, but it is interesting that he's doing it now, especially after getting $3 million. Ben, the book is 560 pages long, which I guess, two former Obama staffers probably shouldn't criticize long memoirs, but I don't know that anybody wants 560 pages about Sarkozy.
Yeah.
Seems like a lot.
Colorful guy at the time. My favorite Sarkozy story was he had this interpreter who was a young woman, not like Sarkozy. She was and she would not just interpret, she would completely mimic his body movements.
Really?
And he was very performative. He would like puff out his chest and kind of pull his lapels and pound on the table. And there'd be this young, like attractive woman next to him doing the exact same thing. It was like watching an actor.
Weird.
It was always like, I was like, that's a weird thing to, clearly he asked for that. And I don't know how to read it. I'm just putting it out there. It was
Strange vibes.
strange, yeah.
I used to read all the Obama-Sarko transcripts.
They
which
were good
always
transcripts,
very
yeah,
entertaining.
yeah.
He would always like talk shit about our buddy in Israel, Mr. Bibi Netanyahu.
Oh, he loved talking shit with Netanyahu. And his wife was Carla Bruni.
Yeah.
And he like tried to put her on the phone or something. Yeah.
Obama is described as, quote, quite cold, introverted, and only marginally interested in those around him, which probably tracks for a meeting with Sarkozy.
I'm sure that is probably an accurate portrayal of... he could be amused by Sarkozy at times. I'd say that.
Yeah, there's a lot to be amused by, but weird dude. Also, seemingly in a lot of trouble. Someday we'll get to the bottom of his intense interest in bombing Libya.
Yeah. It's not great.
Let's turn to Zimbabwe, Ben, because they recently had a presidential election that election observers are calling a fraud. President Emerson Mnangagwa from the ZANU-PF party was declared the winner with 52% of the vote, but the opposition says that the results were completely legitimate. Their supporters were intimidated. Polling places and opposition strongholds were opened late, hours late, and then closed early. But the government, instead of hearing out workers from these election monitoring groups who are crying foul, they arrested them instead. The police arrested 41 of them and seized their computers. So for 37 years, Zimbabwe was ruled by a dictator named Robert Mugabe. He was finally ousted in a military coup in 2017 by one of his former allies. The 2023 election was only the second election since the Mugabe era. Both this election in 2023 and the 2018 election had allegations of widespread fraud. So this last election, though, has been criticized by the African Union and the European Union. So maybe there will be some international pressure to do something about it. I don't know. But it certainly threatens Zimbabwe's ability to fix its economy, clear away international debt, billions of debt, by the way. So basically just a really unfortunate situation here.
Yeah, I mean, this is like, what I'm always struck by when something like this happens is that they only got 52% of the vote. I mean, that means they probably lost by about 30 points.
Yes, exactly.
These guys are totally corrupt. There's vote buying, there's vote rigging, there's intimidation, threats, and all the rest of it, and they still only got 52% of the vote. So in a weird way, I think that is a sign of the strength and vitality of the Zimbabwe opposition. There are a lot of talented people in that opposition. And just the frustration of the people of Zimbabwe with this. I mean, the guys in charge now is like 84, I think. Totally corrupt. Like somehow corruption's gotten worse since
His
Mugabe.
nickname is the Crocodile.
These are not the
what
right
you wanna
group
hear.
of people to be running a country. So my hope is that the Zimbabwean opposition can continue to build momentum. And it tracks very closely to, like, we had Bobby Wine on a couple weeks ago, who's back doing really courageous rallies in Uganda as we speak. And, there you've got Museveni, also in his 80s, also corrupt. I mean, Uganda and Zimbabwe are two countries, one with pretty friendly relations with the United States and Uganda, the other in Zimbabwe where they're under sanction. But, like, that's a place where I would hope, if the pendulum can swing in the direction of democracy, that would open up a lot of space and opportunity for people that have put up a lot of crap. More in Zimbabwe even than Uganda, to be fair.
Yeah, Bobby Wine is a really heroic guy.
Yeah.
By the way, in Uganda, we talked a while back about these laws that were passed where you can get the death penalty for being gay, for quote unquote aggravated homosexuality. Unfortunately, a 20-year-old was the first person to be prosecuted for the offense under these new laws, and could be killed. It's pretty horrific.
A bunch of monsters, yeah.
Absolutely horrific. So Ben, speaking of terrible people in government. So in previous shows, we've talked about a far-right Israeli politician named Itamar Ben-Gvir. He was once ostracized from the political world. He was considered too extreme because of minor things, like having on the wall in his house a photo of a terrorist who shot and murdered 29 Palestinian worshipers and injured over 100 more. But thanks to Bibi Netanyahu, Ben-Gvir now serves as national security minister in the current coalition government. Ben-Gvir went viral recently for saying the following on Israel's version of Meet the Press. Here's a quote. "My right, the right of my wife and my children to move around Judea and Samaria, is more important than freedom of movement for the Arabs. My right to life comes before freedom of movement. Sorry, Mohammed, but that's the reality." That last part, he's addressing it to a journalist named Mohammed on this panel with him. He's talking about driving around the West Bank, basically. The U.S. State Department condemned his comments, called it racist rhetoric. Bibi Netanyahu kind of sort of tried to clean it up. He sort of seemed to suggest the tone was wrong, which led Ben-Gvir to log onto Twitter a day later and say, not only do I not regret what else I said, I'll say it again, and then repeat himself. So the thing I just want to highlight here, Ben, is that you're seeing lots of groups and politicians condemn his language, like the issue was like the tone or the rhetoric. But I think that misses the point.
Or like, sorry, Mohammed.
But like what he's describing, what Ben-Gvir is describing is current policy. You know, Palestinians live under military control. They're forced to travel on separate roads and infrastructure. There's separate legal systems. Like that's the reality on the ground. And this guy is just the asshole describing it plainly.
Yeah, I mean, the thing about Ben-Gvir is his utility is he says out loud, what are the Israeli government's policies, and first of all, there's a lot in that little, clip. Judea and Samaria, that's him signaling that his belief in greater Israel, that Israel, controls all the land, including should control the entire West Bank, should be part of Israel. And that then he's describing in policy the outcome of that belief, which is I should be able to do whatever the fuck I want there. And what he's describing is apartheid. It's not
There's always a debate over the use of this word.
Don't at me on this. If that's not the definition of apartheid, then what is? If me saying I'm sorry, I should be able to do whatever the fuck I want, and if that means there's no rights for these other people, it doesn't matter. Figure out, AIPAC, the clever way to say that's what, and so I think Ben-Gvir continues to remind us, hey, this is actually what this Israeli government is right now.
Yeah, and he wasn't fired. He wasn't let go. He wasn't pushed out. He was barely rebuked.
And he probably wanted the attention he got, and. It's and to your point, people always get upset with he shouldn't have said it that way, or they get upset about the judicial reforms in Israel. There are millions of Palestinians that live in the West Bank that are being regularly dehumanized, not just by rhetoric like that, but by actions.
Yeah, and also we're at a time when there's more violence between Israeli and Palestinian communities than ever before. There's horrible settler violence. There has been terrorism against innocent Israeli communities. Everything's getting worse, and rhetoric like this absolutely contributes to it.
That's right. I mean, that's a really important point because that kind of rhetoric is a bit of a dog whistle, or not even a dog whistle, to the people who've been engaged in things like settler violence or intimidation of Palestinians. Be I'm the government minister for national security telling you that's what. That kind of vigilantism is fine.
It's cool. Your life matters more. Do what you got to do. Yeah. That's what it says. Finally, Ben, last week we talked about Russia's failed effort to land a lunar probe on the southern pole of the moon. But since that recording, India has succeeded in the same task. Their space rover is now searching for evidence of frozen water that might help support future missions or life on the moon. India is only the fourth country to land on the moon after the United States, which was obviously fake, the Soviet Union, and China. Amazingly, the mission cost just $75 million, which CNN pointed out is less than half the budget of the movie Interstellar. How is that possible?
Huh. That's interesting stat, yeah. I mean, does this mean that they have to change acronyms from BRICS to BRICS?
Who's the Burke?
BI, India. It's a really. I just made the nerdiest joke.
I'll take it.
It's the nerdiest joke it's ever been made at the 50-minute mark of Pod Save the World, but I think I needed to make
plays.
it. I think it plays. Does it travel? Okay.
I think. Look, it's been a tough week for Putin.
It has.
His rover crashes. He's got to zoom into the conference call.
He's got the Prigozhin funeral to manage. I mean, if they find this water, does this mean they get on first dibs on the colony? I mean, that's the thing you wonder over time.
Yeah, that part I don't get. I did read that India is now launching a solar probe. So they're really getting into the space game.
I mean, they have a pretty intense, advanced, scientific base. That's it's a reminder that countries like India are going to start doing the kind of stuff that superpowers do.
Yeah, and they got a lot of missiles.
Superpowers do as superpowers do.
Yeah,
I mean, to be fair, from the alternative point of view, there's a lot of poverty in India. So there's kind of remember that, I guess I can go, that famous song, Whitey on the Moon by Gil Scott-Heron?
No.
It's basically about while things are shitty down here in the U.S., Whitey's on the moon. But it captures the sentiment of why are we spending all this money to go to the moon when we have these problems down here? I guess what's interesting about Modi to be serious for a second, is he's managed to like turn that into the pride that people feel in Indian nationalism gives him a lot of space to do this kind of stuff, even though there's a lot of poverty that he has to deal with in India.
Yeah, it's interesting how that nationalism is able to distract
Nationalism's
from
a bitch, yeah.
almost everything. Yeah. Okay, we're going to take a quick break. When we come back, you will hear Ben's interview with Joshua Yaffa from The New Yorker about the Prigozhin murder and all things Russia, so stick around for that. Pod Save the World is brought to you by Harry's. What do I want in a skincare regimen? Here's what I want. I want to always have fresh blades at the ready when I shave so that I don't have some dull, awful blade cutting the hell out of my face or giving me an uneven shave. I don't want to have to go to a store and find someone to help me get the blades that are behind the counter for some reason and take tons of different time. That's why Harry's is the best. Whether your ritual is minimal or elevated, you can level up your shave game with Harry's sleekest razor yet, the Craft Handle. Experience the latest and greatest in the Harry's razor lineup delivered straight to your door for just $10 at harrys.com/savetheworld. Harry's Craft Handle is a smooth metallic handle that feels weighty and well-balanced in your hand. It's innovatively designed to deliver the same great shave you expect, but with a killer new look. Grab the Craft Handle starter set for just $10. It includes the Craft Handle 5-blade German-engineered razor cartridges, shaving gel, and a travel cover. Plus, you can schedule replacement blade delivery with refills as low as $2. Step up your routine even more with dozens of affordable items to choose, like shaving creams, post-shave balm, body washes, and hydrating lotions. With the highest customer satisfaction in the shaving industry, they're still offering a no-risk trial. Don't like your shave? No worries. It's on them. Harry's is great. It could not be easier. The blades just show up at your house. The Craft Handle is nice. It works. The look and feel is great. And look, I just like it. I like the shaving cream. I like the face lotion. I got it all. Elevate your shave with the latest and greatest in Harry's razor handle lineup today. Get your $17 Craft Handle starter set for just $10 at harrys.com/savetheworld. That's harrys.com/savetheworld. Pod Save the World is brought to you by Simply Safe. The average break-in lasts 8 to 10 minutes, so fast response is crucial. That's why Simply Safe Home Security launched its breakthrough technology, 24/7 live guard protection to help stop crime in real time. Now, Simply Safe professional monitoring agents can actually see, speak to, and deter intruders in your home through a new smart alarm wireless indoor camera. Wow, do I worry about break-ins? Yes, I have experienced one in my life. It is horribly frightening. It is invasive, and you feel violated, like your space was violated after. And man, I would have loved it if all of a sudden my little alarm camera started talking shit to the person who had broken in. Simply Safe professional monitoring agents can now warn intruders that they are being recorded, and police are on their way in real time, stopping them in their tracks. 24/7 live guard protection is made possible by the new Smart Alarm wireless indoor camera available with the Fast Protect monitoring plan. The new Smart Alarm indoor camera is the only indoor security camera that can trigger the alarm and instantly deter intruders with built-in sirens. With advanced motion detection and vision AI, the Smart Alarm indoor camera can sense the difference between potential intruders and pets to reduce false alarms. 24/7 live guard protection in the new Smart Alarm indoor camera works seamlessly as part of the entire Simply Safe security system to keep your whole home safe from break-ins, fires, floods, and more. Right now, Pod Save the World listeners can get a special 20% off any Simply Safe system when you sign up for a free month trial of Fast Protect monitoring. This special offer is for a limited time only. Visit simplysafe.com/crookedworld. That's simplysafe.com/crookedworld. There's no safe like Simply Safe.
It has been a week since a private jet crashed in Russia, killing all 10 passengers. The Russian government has now confirmed that Wagner chief Yevgeny Prigozhin and his number 2, Dmitry Utkin, were on board. They did this in a very Russian way. They didn't name the men. They just said that the DNA matched the passenger list. Prigozhin was laid to rest today, buried in heavy security in St. Petersburg at a site that will no doubt become a strange pilgrimage site to mercenaries and far-right Russian fascists for some time to come. But obviously lots of implications to this. So joining me today to discuss Prigozhin's rise and fall is Joshua Yaffa, who wrote an in-depth profile of the Russian warlord for The New Yorker, which everybody should read. It's really fantastic, a few weeks ago, and is also the author of the great book, Between Two Fires, Truth, Ambition, and Compromise in Putin's Russia. Joshua, thanks so much for being with us.
Thanks for having me.
Okay, so let's start with Prigozhin's legacy. You spent a bunch of time, obviously, for that recent New Yorker piece looking at him. You have a great line in this that was flagged for me by our producer, and I remember seeing this at the time and thinking it was awesome. Prigozhin's rise and fall contains a certain gangland banality, a killer on the make hired by other more powerful killers to commit more of the same at larger scale is ultimately offed by those same killers. This is a story in which all the parts are played by bad guys, which is definitely how it feels. What do you think Prigozhin's legacy is, and what does it tell us about kind of what's happened to Russia as someone who's been following this for some time?
There's this term initially created by the great Russia watcher Mark Galeotti, who referred to Putin's Russia, especially this kind of late stage Putin's Russia, where we've arrived as an ad hocracy, with kind of ad hoc symbolizing the kind of by design, not so much chaos of the system, though sometimes that's the right word for it, but in the way to which official position matters less than the role that someone is performing for the system or for Putin personally, and that kind of where someone is on the technical kind of government org chart matters less than, where are they actually in terms of the real relationships of power and relevance and also functionality to the Putin state, right? Just because someone has a certain job title doesn't mean they're actually performing the real function for the Putin system. It could be someone from outside the system, technically or formally, who does that. And Prigozhin, I think, really epitomizes in its most macabre form this ad hocracy in which someone who was a restaurateur and caterer ends up being the boss and figurehead of Russia's largest mercenary outfit that ends up taking on this outsized role in the invasion of Ukraine. I mean, it's all so ridiculous, but also deeply emblematic, I think, of the way the Putin system functions, and Prigozhin's legacy, I think, is to both prove this thesis, but also test its limits, test how far the Putin system itself can tolerate this sort of ad hocracy. Because the problem is when you allow your loose cannon, seemingly sadistic, of questionable mental, I think, kind of sanity, at times, buddy, it now seems, from St. Petersburg after Prigozhin's death, Putin said that, in fact, he was familiar with Prigozhin since the 90s. When you allow someone like that to recruit tens of thousands of Russian prisoners from jail, put guns in their hands and send them to fight and die in Ukraine, like, how is that not going to end badly, right? In retrospect, right? There's not a whole lot of surprise, perhaps, that this didn't turn out like great for anybody. And so it's convenient in a way to let these people with unofficial titles or no title at all do your dirty work. You get deniability, you get a certain flexibility, you get to manage things based on personal relationships, which we know Putin prefers to managing things through a kind of formal hierarchical process. But there's a cost to it. And so the Prigozhin story is a story about all of that. What running a country this way can offer you if you're an autocrat bent on invading another country like Putin is, but also how it's not cost free, even from the kind of, to borrow another book title, like The Dictator's Handbook, it might not always be in the end so efficacious or advantageous to let your caterer end up running a private military company.
Yeah. Clearly, Putin arrived at that decision after some time, given that plane fell out of the sky. And that's, I want to ask you, obviously, we're purely speculating whenever it comes to things like this in Russian politics. But presuming that this plane was shot down or blown up or taken down in some way by Putin or on Putin's behalf, that is a pretty dramatic way to take the guy out. There could have been any other, they could have been poisoned like Navalny was, or he could have fallen off a balcony like a bunch of other people have. This was
or to your point, like he was just, and he took multiple trips to Africa, where Wagner has a huge presence in different African countries, Central African Republic, Mali, elsewhere. And he was just in Africa days before he returned to Russia and then died in this plane crash. Like, there are many ways you could off someone in Africa and make it look just kind of mysterious and weird and unsolvable. And like, you know, it happened, say, somewhere like in the bush in Central African Republic. Like, you'll never, even if it's still suspected that Putin did it, like, you'll never really get to the bottom of it. Like, it's a choice to blow someone out of the sky as they're flying from Moscow to St. Petersburg.
It's a hell of a choice. And that's what I wanted to ask you, because essentially there are a couple of different ways of looking at that. One is that, you know, there was a militarized aspect to it. You know, like Prigozhin shot down Russian military helicopters, so you know, he comes down in a plane. Then there's also the fact that he was with some of his chief deputies, including Utkin, who you spend some great time on in your piece. So it kind of has this flavor of decapitating Wagner. I mean, why do you think this was such a dramatic event rather than just him, you know, disappearing in the bush or falling off a balcony?
I think a bit of all of the above, but ultimately the drama has to be part of the point. And here I'm just kind of working backwards in a way, like seeing as the Kremlin, Putin will never really know, but someone or some combination of people in that high-level brain trust around Putin chose this form of assassination, effectively, over others. So there has to have been some intent or purpose there, and I can only then deduce that the drama, the in-your-faceness of it had to have been part of the plan, and that, like, you mount a mutiny against us, you're not just going to, like, disappear in some, like, weird, never quite solved sort of way. Like, no, we're going to blow you out of the sky. And I'm sure from reporting here, I'm mainly going off what I've read others report in the past few days, though I have some my own context still in Moscow as well, who say, like, message received, you know, I'm talking about here people, not so much the elites, every man or woman on the street, but the elites. And I think this assassination was designed, maybe first and foremost, to get rid of Prigozhin and this high level Wagner leadership around him. It solves a certain problem for Putin, but also the demonstration aspect, I think, is as important. And in terms of making a demonstration to others in or around the elite, I think this drives the point home in ways that other more squishy, deniable forms of getting rid of Prigozhin wouldn't have been quite emphatic, wouldn't have made the point quite as emphatically.
Yeah. No, and you and I have talked about the Boris Nemtsov assassination, you know, right in front of the Kremlin, basically. So they like a demonstration effect. On Wagner itself, one of the really interesting things in your piece was how you drew out, you know, some of these guys, like Utkin, for instance, you know, were real ideologues of the far right. You know, Wagner is Hitler's favorite composer. It's not subtle. And I'm wondering, as you step back and look at Wagner without Prigozhin, and we'll get in a minute to kind of like, you know, what's going to happen in Africa. But just looking at the organization itself, when you were looking at it and reporting on it, how much did you think there was an ideology to the kind of core of Wagner guys? Like they believe in some form of extreme Russian nationalism or something, versus how much of it was totally just kind of guns for hire, people, you know, looking to get paid, versus people truly loyal to Prigozhin? I mean, like, how do you make up the motivations in your reporting of the Wagner membership?
I think that there are different answers for different segments of Wagner. Let's start with, for example, at least by the end of Wagner's operations in Ukraine, the most numerically dominant, these prisoners, by all estimations, tens of thousands, 40, 50,000 convicts recruited from Russian prisons and sent as cannon fodder, really, to Ukraine, largely to fight and die, as nearly half of them did in the battle for Bakhmut. These are people who acted out of desperation. I don't mean to minimize or remove responsibility from them. They chose to go fight in Ukraine for Wagner. Of course, there are all elements of kind of pressure, manipulation, and so on put on them. And plus, they were just in a terrible situation. In being held for years in Russian prison is not exactly a nice experience, or one you could imagine having a high degree of desperation to escape. And I think that word desperation describes that contingent of Wagner the most. I spoke to a handful of convict fighters who were recruited into Wagner for the long piece that was published in the New Yorker a few weeks ago. And they all spoke about exactly the sense of hopelessness, convinced that they would die in Russian prisons. So why not roll the dice and maybe die in Ukraine? They were quite clear-eyed about the chances of that. But perhaps, as Prigozhin promised, they would fight, survive for 6 months, and then be granted their freedom. So those are people who are not necessarily fighting for like the greater Russian cause, not particularly ideological, not even that devoted to Putin or Prigozhin himself, just acting out of personal desperation. On the other end of the spectrum, you have this upper echelon of top Prigozhin commanders, people who were effectively running Wagner's military operations in Ukraine, Africa, and elsewhere, a number of whom were killed on this plane crash, or rather plane explosion, but not all of them. And those are people who historically were quite loyal to Prigozhin himself, who would not have had access to that kind of wealth, power, stature, any of it, if it wasn't for Wagner and if it wasn't for Prigozhin personally sort of granting them that power. Interestingly, we've seen some of them, I don't know if it would be fair to say turn against Prigozhin or turn against Wagner, but allow themselves to be recruited out of Wagner to join other upstart private military companies that the Kremlin or other elements of the Russian state are now trying to put forward as kind of Wagner replacements. So there's been some splintering of Wagner, and that shows that loyalties didn't run that deep if some of these commanders were tempted by other opportunities for power, money, and the rest if they went off and joined these splinter groups. And so in the end of the day, I'm not sure what's really left or what is holding together Wagner as an institution, and maybe not that much.
Yeah.
At the end of the day, it's a mercenary outfit, right? People joined it initially back in 2014, 15, and onwards because they got paid. They got paid a lot more than they did in the regular Russian armed forces.
Yeah.
And I think first and foremost, that was always the selling point of Wagner. So
then that raises the question of what happens to Wagner's operations beyond Ukraine. And obviously, we've talked a lot on this podcast about their operations in Central African Republic, or kind of the coup belt of Burkina Faso and Mali, or in Sudan. They've obviously been active in Syria. They've got guys there. What happens to that? Like, is this a situation where you could, on the one hand, have the Russian state try to swallow some of that up, but that kind of denies them this, separate entity that is not the Russian government operating in all these countries? Or I was interested in what you just said. Is it going to be like Wagner under different leadership, or maybe it's going to be a different new version of a private mercenary group that just is the same thing, but it's called a different name and has a different, org chart? I mean, what do you think happens to Wagner in Africa and the Middle East?
A bit of all of that. I think Wagner essentially may be the right metaphor. I could be wrong about this, but my guess is that it'll be effectively sold for parts, that there's a lot of other interests in and around the Russian state, whether it's the military, intelligence services, other oligarchs who already have gotten into the private military company game. Gennady Timchenko, someone whose name I'm sure has come up periodically on this podcast as a longtime Putin crony and billionaire who made his money trading Russian oil, for many years has had a private military company that also, long before any of this, before the invasion of Ukraine, had been operating in Syria alongside Wagner, and they were already getting into some conflicts and rivalries in Syria. So I think that sort of thing is just going to blossom even further, and that there will be not 3 or 5, but 10 or 15 Russian private military companies. GRU, Russian military intelligence, might have a private military company. The Ministry of Defense under Shoigu might have a private military company. Timchenko has his private military company. Arkady Rottenberg, another close associate of Putin's, might have his own private military company, and that they'll all be competing for the resources and remnants of Wagner. Wagner itself in some form might also survive, but it'll certainly be a diminished form, because I'm certain that much of its leadership and fighters will be siphoned away for some of these other projects, but there might still be a core Wagner that obviously will have to report to new masters. Who those masters will be remains undetermined. But you're right about one of the conundrums that the Kremlin faces, which is the trade-off between controlling these future structures, something that clearly Putin came to regret. I think it's now fair to say, kind of retrospectively, we could say Putin came to regret not having more control over Wagner, and that Prigozhin, this loose cannon, was allowed to, turn Wagner's troops and firepower against the Russian state. Clearly a red line for Putin, something he regrets having happened. So the answer to that is you try and bring these groups more into the so-called vertical of power as the Putin-era political hierarchy is known. But the downside, as you identified, is then you have less deniability. Then you really own those operations in a way you didn't when you had this ostensibly private company running around. If you remember, some years ago, Putin famously compared Prigozhin to George Soros in suggesting, you have people like, you have private interests, who have a role in American civic life, like George Soros. We have our Yevgeny Prigozhin. So it was convenient to have, even if, in a strategic level, Prigozhin took his marching orders or coordinated his efforts with larger Kremlin geopolitical priorities. It must have been nice, or it must have been convenient for Putin to have this deniable distance. Yeah. And so the trade-off between control, deniability, where the Kremlin ultimately lands on that, I think is definitely an open question.
And so last question here. I mean, you described just now, I think, this kind of mafia government, right? Like different guys in fiefdoms, with their different capabilities, all under the boss of Putin. And so it's kind of evolved into this mafia kleptocracy wrapped in a Russian nationalist ideology. But what does this change anything about Russia's internal politics? What are you going to be looking for in the next 6 months to a year in terms of how Russian internal politics, either among the elite or among the public, is impacted by this, or what's the next chapter in the drama, knowing it's impossible to predict, but just what are you going to be watching?
I think short term, this does achieve Putin's desired effect in terms of sending a signal to the elite, getting people in line, showing the cost of disobedience, of acting against the state. Anyone who thinks they were going to try and pull off mutiny 2.0 or some version of it got a pretty clear signal of what awaits them. And it definitely heightens the prisoner dilemma, complications of trying to mount any sort of, whether it be coup or any sort of effort to undermine or let alone overthrow Putin from within the elite. The calculations of who wants to be the first mover, the first to act, just went up a lot in terms of people being aware of the cost of that. Another reminder of better not to stick my neck out. And if no one wants to be the first one to stick their neck out, well, then no one will at all. Yeah. But in the longer term, though, I'm wary of entering into this, but in the longer term, the Putin system is, of course, weakened analysis, because while I do believe it, Putin 23 years and counting into power, I feel like it's a bit, we're the ones who begin to look a bit foolish prognosticating about, Putin's impending at indeterminate timescale demise, and to borrow the famous cliche from economics, like in the long run we're all dead. So Putin's reign will end at some point. There will be eventually we'll be right when Putin finally leaves office, even if it's from natural causes. But yet again, as a result of this Prigozhin seeming assassination, like I said, in the short term, I think the system and Putin personally is strengthened. In the long term, of course, this leads to a slow-term fracturing, destabilization, whatever you want to call it, of the regime, because it basically shows that there's no exit. There's no possibility for kind of soft change. There's no possibility to make a deal even with the Kremlin. If you recall, in the days after the mutiny, after Prigozhin ended it or agreed to end it, Putin, and especially Putin's spokesman, Dmitry Peskov, went out and said, essentially, all is forgiven.
Yeah.
Criminal charges will be dropped. Prigozhin can go to Belarus. 2 months later, his plane is blown out of the sky. So while those elites in the short term are going to be frightened, in the long term, they're also thinking, well, we can't really trust Putin or the system that acts in his name. And also, and most potentially one day, who knows, in the distant future or medium future, decisive, is an idea that actually circulated, I came across in a Wagner-affiliated Telegram channel in the hours after the Prigozhin plane was shot down. It was like a one-line posting that immediately was reposted and quoted elsewhere in other Wagner-related channels. But that, the real lesson of this whole episode is always go to the end.
Yeah.
And that suggests, that Prigozhin made two mistakes, you could say. The first was thinking that he could pull off the mutiny in the first place. But the second mistake was having launched the mutiny, that he agreed to end it.
Yeah.
And that in hindsight was his perhaps fatal mistake. And if and when there is a person or group of people thinking about another round of something like that, they're not going to be stopping to negotiate with the Kremlin. They're going to realize the only way to stay alive, frankly, maybe is to go to the end, as it were.
Yeah, you guard the king, you best not miss. All right, well, look, thanks so much. Everybody should check out your book, Between Two Fires, but also this article in The New Yorker is just an amazing resource and also an enjoyable read because Prigozhin, if nothing else, was good content, but a horrific human being at that. So, Joshua, thanks so much. Good talking to you.
Yeah, always happy to be here. Thanks.
Thanks again to Joshua Yaffa for joining the show. What else we got? Fire that guy in Spain. That's all I can.
Yeah.
And the Panama Canal is
and
top three canals.
I just want more Trump Canal content. There's got to be some other canals, Erie Canal, or maybe we can go back to Suez.
Just keep him on Tucker's show.
There's something about that show where because Tucker just let him go. That was that always makes for the most revelatory Trump interviews because he just starts rambling in ways that give you a sense of like the internal monologue in Donald Trump. And
it's funny because Tucker's like, did Epstein kill himself? And all of a sudden you're talking about the Panama Canal. You can tell Tucker's so frustrated. He just wants like some like incitement kind of content.
Yeah, don't they want to kill you? He kept asking Trump, and then Trump's sticking to the Panama Canal. He's like, nah. But back to the Panama Canal.
Anyway, the mosquitoes do.
Yeah. Vicious
mosquitoes. 35,000 dead. That's it for us. But talk to you guys next week.